Dawn on January 24th, 1945, found First Lieutenant Garlin N. Conner in a frozen battalion command post with the 3rd Battalion, 7th Infantry Regiment near Houssen, France. He was only 25, serving as the unit's intelligence officer, and he'd barely made it back from the hospital, wounds still stiff, still healing, when the morning began to unravel. Out in front, German artillery ripped into the tree line a few hundred yards away, shredding trunks and throwing frozen earth into the air. The enemy wasn't probing this time. They were assembling for a punch meant to crack the American position wide open. Roughly 600 infantry and 6 heavy Mark VI tanks, the kind many Americans simply called Tigers, moving to break through the line near the Colmar pocket. Conner didn't look like the kind of man who was supposed to stop that. He was small, lean, a Kentucky farm kid who'd grown up working tobacco and never had easy access to schooling. But the war had turned him into something else. He'd enlisted in 1941, survived years of campaigns and landings, been hit again and again, and he'd built a reputation in the battalion for one defining pattern. When things became hopeless, he moved toward the danger instead of away from it. The Colmar pocket was the last stubborn slice of German-held territory in France, winter-hard ground of woods and fields in Alsace, anchored near the Rhine. Attempts to crush it had dragged on for months. Operation Nordwind had kicked off on New Year's Day, the final big German offensive in the west, and even as other battles raged to the north, the men trapped in this pocket fought like they had nothing left to lose. The cold made everything worse. Bitter temperatures, heavy snow, foxholes that froze into stone. Nights where patrols crept close enough to make sleep feel like a mistake. In theory, Conner's job was behind the line. Intelligence officers studied maps, questioned prisoners, sifted patrol reports, and tried to predict enemy movement. They weren't supposed to be the ones staring the attack in the face. Then the barrage intensified, shells walking across the forward positions, trees bursting, earth geysering up in hard clumps of ice and dirt. And just as suddenly, it stopped. The silence that followed was almost more frightening than the noise. A runner crashed into the command post with the words that mattered. Tanks. Infantry behind them. A whole wave pushing toward the battalion's left. The battalion commander checked the map and saw it immediately. If those heavy tanks reached the foxholes, they'd roll straight through them. There were no American tanks sitting ready to counter. No tank destroyers in the right place. The only weapon that could truly disrupt 6 heavy tanks and hundreds of infantry in that terrain was artillery. If someone could see the attack and correct the fire. But the forward observation post had been smashed in the preparation barrage. The men who should have been calling the guns were dead or wounded. From the command post, the view was a wall of trees and snow. Conner studied the map like it was a set of doors he could pick open. Then he made his choice. He grabbed a field telephone and a long spool of wire, hundreds of yards of it, and stepped outside into the snow. He didn't wait for permission. He didn't argue. He simply moved. He ran into the open ground between the command post and the line, the wire paying out behind him as he went. The surface crust broke under his boots with every step. He carried the spool in one hand, the handset in the other, dragging his connection to the battalion with him like a lifeline. The German guns found him quickly. Shells began to fall near enough to slap the air out of his chest. Trees snapped and detonated into splinters. Blasts punched the snow into dirty clouds that stung his face and filled his mouth with grit. He stumbled, kept his balance, and kept running, because stopping in open ground would be worse than falling. He reached the American foxholes, and didn't stop there. Conner pushed forward beyond the line to a shallow ditch only a little deeper than a man's body when he flattened himself into it. It was miserable cover. Not enough against a direct hit, not enough against a tank's gun, barely enough against bullets if the angle was wrong. But it gave him one priceless thing: the ability to see. He dropped into the ditch, cranked the handset, and got his connection. The Artillery Fire Direction Center answered from miles behind the front. Conner gave his position, and with it, his new role. He was now the battalion's eyes. When he lifted his head above the rim, he saw German infantry moving through the trees in disciplined rushes, one element advancing, another covering, closing the distance with the confidence of experienced troops. And behind them came the heavy tanks, shouldering through the forest like it wasn't there. Conner called the first mission in. Seconds later, shells shrieked overhead and detonated. Too far back. He didn't waste time cursing it. He corrected the fall, tightened the distance, and called again. The next volley arrived where it mattered. The forest erupted. Trunks shattered, branches atomized, fragments ripping through the air. The German advance hesitated, then broke its rhythm. Conner ordered repeat fire, holding the impact zone in place long enough to turn that patch of woods into a nightmare. But the tanks kept coming. The heavy armor rolled out toward the open ground. Artillery wasn't made for clean tank kills, and Conner knew it. Still, he shifted his calls onto the armored wedge, walking explosions closer, seeking damaged tracks, shattered optics, anything that would slow the monsters before they reached the foxholes. Near misses didn't stop them. The tanks pushed through blasts and smoke, and their guns began to speak. Thunder cracks, followed by foxholes erupting into dirt and snow. With every minute, the tanks were nearer, and if they crossed the line, panic would spread like fire. Conner tightened the fire again. Closer. Closer. The shell smashed a track, and one of the lead tanks lurched and stopped, immobilized, but still lethal. Another took damage that poured smoke from the rear, yet the remaining armor adjusted, angling toward the one man who mattered. They had spotted the problem. Maybe it was movement. Maybe it was the wire. Maybe it was simply instinct. But the tanks began to converge on the ditch, hunting the observer who was turning artillery into a wall. Conner looked at the thin dirt around him and knew what it could not do. It would not stop an 88. It would not stop machine gun fire. It would not save him if the tanks chose to erase that strip of ground. So he made the decision that every manual warns against. He lifted the handset and ordered the guns to fire on his position. On the other end of the line, the fire direction officer repeated the coordinates back, incredulous. Conner confirmed. He was asked again. He confirmed again. He understood exactly what he was doing, asking friendly shells to land within yards of where he lay. The first rounds crashed down in front of the ditch with violence that made the world feel like it had cracked in half. Pressure slammed his lungs. Dirt and ice hammered down. Shrapnel hissed overhead. He stayed pressed into the ditch, handset clenched tight, and called another correction. Closer. Another volley landed so near he could feel heat and shock waves roll across his skin. Fragments tore through the air just feet above the rim. If he rose, he'd be shredded. If the shells walked in any closer, he'd be buried. The tanks stopped advancing. Hatches slammed shut. Even Tiger crews didn't want to be exposed when shells were detonating at point-blank range. But the infantry wasn't done. Survivors regrouped and moved in the tank's shadow, using the armor as rolling cover. The attack tried to restart. Conner answered by painting the ground with explosions, dragging the impact zone back and forth to break each new push. When infantry clustered, he dropped rounds onto them. When tanks edged forward, he slammed the earth directly in front of their noses. A direct hit jarred a turret hard enough to cripple its movement. Another tank lost mobility, and, under the punishment, a crew finally bailed out and ran for the rear. some of them cut down by American fire from the foxholes. Still, 3 heavy tanks remained functional, and the infantry kept crawling closer, using craters and snow for cover. Conner could see faces now. He could see small groups trying to slide around his position, trying to reach the wire that fed his lifeline. If they cut it, the artillery would go blind, and the battalion would be back to bare rifles and frozen courage. The cold was eating him alive. His hands and feet were numb. Each near impact dumped grit into his eyes and mouth. The handset grew slick with ice. He didn't let go. Then German shells began to fall near the ditch as well, counterfire bracketing his position. In a tightening radius, German rounds and American rounds pounded the same patch of ground. Men in the foxholes behind him could see the impossible scene. One lone lieutenant ahead of the line, refusing to move, holding the guns on target while both armies tried to kill him. The German infantry surged again, closer still, close enough that he could hear shouted commands and the clack of rifle actions. Conner dragged the artillery even nearer, dropping explosions into the narrow space between him and the advancing line. Blast waves hammered him. Dirt poured into the ditch. Something struck his shoulder, fragment or stone, he couldn't tell, pain turning into a dead, numb heaviness. He shifted the handset to his other hand and kept calling. The remaining tanks spread out to make themselves harder targets. Conner split his corrections, left tank, center tank, right tank, seeking anything that would slow the advance. A shell slammed the front of one tank hard enough to rock it back. The driver lost control for a heartbeat. The track caught on frozen debris and the machine slewed into a jam. 2 tanks still moved, and the infantry was inside 50 yards. A young German officer crawled and gestured his men forward without raising his voice, signaling for a skirmish line to close in from multiple angles at once, rifles ready, snow packed into sleeves and collars, eyes fixed on the ditch where the wire disappeared. Conner watched them coming, handset pressed tight to his ear, and prepared to drag the explosions even closer, because if he lost that line, he lost the battalion. Conner spun the crank on the handset and snapped out a fresh correction. Bring it in 5, fire for effect. The next impacts crashed into the snow barely a couple dozen yards ahead of his ditch. The young German officer vanished in the blast, along with several men around him. The rest of that small push flattened instantly, faces pressed into ice, bodies welded to the ground, waiting for the punishment to lift. It didn't lift. Conner refused to give them a pause. He kept the pattern alive, nudging it left, then right, stitching a continuous curtain of detonations between the ditch and the infantry. The rounds were so close now that warmth flashed across his cheeks. Fragments skittered off the lip of the ditch like thrown gravel. Some of that metal dropped inside with him. A jagged shard punched into frozen soil a couple inches from his right hand and stayed there, humming with heat. Beyond the wall of blasts, the 2 remaining heavy tanks ground closer to the American line, close enough to use their machine guns properly. Bow guns opened up, long, sustained bursts that chewed the tree line and churned snow into dirty spray around the foxholes. The men in the holes fired back, but they were throwing pebbles at a moving bunker. American gunners tried the only thing they could think of, raking the vision slits, trying to blind drivers, trying to force hatches shut and slow the armor down. It wasn't enough. The tanks kept pushing. Conner swung his attention back to the armor and demanded a mix, smoke with high explosive. If he could rob the tank commanders of sight, maybe he could steal their momentum long enough to break the attack. The battery complied. Smoke rounds and HE began to fall around the tanks. A thick white cloud boiled upward, choking and spreading, swallowing metal shapes whole. For a second, it looked like the problem had disappeared. Then Conner heard it. Engines, tracks, the grinding, steady sound of weight moving forward through frozen ground. The smoke hadn't stopped them. It had only made them harder to hit. One of the tanks pushed out of the haze, frighteningly close to the foxholes. The main gun spoke, an 88mm crack that turned an American machine gun position into a burst of snow and splinters. Men went down. Conner didn't hesitate. He called a mission directly onto the tank, danger close, with coordinates that made the line go quiet for half a beat. The fire direction officer knew what those numbers meant. With a 105 shell, the lethal fragment zone could easily swallow the observer when the rounds landed that near. Conner repeated the correction anyway. The rounds arrived. One burst behind the tank, another to the flank, a third detonated right in front of the hull, and the blast tore into the front end with enough violence to shatter the driver's vision port. The tank lurched, veered, and slammed into a crater. Tracks spun. The machine stuck fast, blind, trapped, and suddenly useless. That left one heavy tank still moving, and the infantry, reorganized, angry, disciplined, began to flow again, shifting their angle, using the smoke and craters like a screen. Conner couldn't see them clearly anymore, so he listened. He caught voices in the haze, boots crunching snow, the metallic click of bolts. He guessed, called fire, and adjusted by sound, dragging explosions toward the loudest cluster, sliding them left when he heard movement left, dragging them back right when the noise shifted. Then another problem landed on him through the handset. The battery was running short. Maybe 15 minutes of sustained fire left before they'd have to slow down and reload. 15 minutes without artillery in this moment wasn't inconvenient. It was a gap the Germans could drive a battalion through. By now, Conner had been in that ditch well over an hour. At some point earlier, a private from the battalion intelligence section had crawled out to him with extra wire and a backup handset. The kid lay a few feet away, scanning the smoke and calling out anything he caught, movement, shadows, shapes that didn't belong. Now the private hissed a warning. Motion close, too close. Conner threw out the coordinates. The next blasts hit barely a dozen yards out. The shock lifted both men off the bottom of the ditch and slammed them back down. Dirt and ice rained in. Something struck the private and he screamed. Shrapnel through the leg, blood spilling bright onto white snow. Conner dragged him deeper into what little cover they had. The private was still conscious and needed a medic. He refused to leave. He clamped down on the pain, kept his eyes up, kept watching for shapes in the smoke. Meanwhile, the last heavy tank crawled nearer the American line, and German infantry slid in so close to the ditch that Conner knew he was one rush away from being smothered, so he pulled the artillery even tighter. He dropped the impacts to within a handful of yards in front of the ditch, closer than anything he'd called so far. The blast punched him off the ground. He hit frozen earth hard enough to knock the air out of his lungs. For a moment, there was no sound at all, just a blank, dead silence. Then the ringing began, a high, permanent scream inside his skull. When he blinked and looked again, the Germans who'd been almost on top of him were simply gone, hands shaking. Whether from cold, shock, exhaustion, he couldn't tell anymore. He worked the handset again. The voice on the other end sounded far away, like it was coming through water. Conner shifted back to the last tank. It was now so close to the foxholes that its machine guns could pin down nearly every defensive position, and its main gun could start erasing holes one by one at point-blank range. The turrets swung, searching. The commander rose in the hatch again, scanning, choosing. Conner gave the coordinates and demanded maximum concentration. Everything the battery could throw at one point. A full salvo arrived at once and swallowed the tank in a storm of detonations. When the smoke thinned, the shape was still there, armor intact, but it wasn't moving. The driver's vision blocks were shattered. The commander ducked back inside and slammed the hatch. The vehicle was blind and stuck. Moments later, the crew bailed out and sprinted for the tree line. Rifle fire from the foxholes cut several of them down before the rest disappeared into cover. All 6 heavy tanks were now dead weight, destroyed outright or abandoned where they sat. But the fight wasn't finished. German infantry still held the ground in front, scattered across a wide stretch of woods and fields, battered but not broken. They'd taken brutal losses. Yet there were still hundreds of veterans out there who knew how to fight without armor if they had to. Conner kept the barrage moving, walking it through tree lines, across crater fields, along likely approaches, smashing every attempt to rally before it could become a new push. The battery called again. Ammunition was nearly gone. Then the battalion commander broke in with an order to pull back to the American line. Covering fire would be laid down. Conner could make it. He didn't move. From that shallow ditch, he could see too much. Every cluster, every shift, every attempt to reform. If he withdrew, the guns would be guessing again. Guessing meant shells would fall wide. Wide meant the Germans might find the one clean minute they needed to surge. The wounded private stayed beside him, pale and determined, rifle ready. The bleeding had slowed, cold doing what bandages couldn't, while he continued to watch the smoke for shapes. By now, German artillery found Conner's patch of ground. Rounds began to fall behind the ditch, then closer, walking in with cold precision. Another minute like that, and the next shell would drop right on top of them. Conner switched tasks and called for counter battery, feeding back the likely German gun positions. American fire shifted. Minutes later, the enemy barrage weakened, then faded. Conner immediately dragged the guns back onto the infantry. Daylight climbed higher. The field in front of him became visible in full, grim detail. Wrecked tanks, cratered earth, shattered trees, bodies in the snow. The Germans could see it too, could see what the attack had cost, could see that the armor was gone, could see that the ground itself had been turned against them by one man with a telephone. A last squad tried to sprint in from the side, betting speed could beat correction. They broke cover, ran hard, and made it only part way before the shells found them. The attempt vanished in blasts that threw snow and bodies up into the air. After that, no one tried another rush. The battery reported only minutes of fire remaining, but the German attack had already collapsed. Survivors began to fall back, dragging wounded, abandoning dead. Conner kept the shells chasing them, pressing the retreat, making sure they didn't stop, didn't regroup, didn't gather their courage for one more try. Roughly 3 hours after he grabbed the handset and wire and left the command post, the counterattack was finished. Conner stayed in the ditch a while longer anyway, scanning, waiting, making sure the withdrawal was real. Eventually, the handset went quiet. The guns had to cool, reload, prepare for whatever came next. The battlefield fell into an eerie calm. No engines, no rifle cracks, no detonations. Only wind through splintered trees and the thin, distant voices of wounded men. Conner finally stood, and his legs almost betrayed him. Hours in frozen dirt had locked his body into one stiff shape. He took a step, then another. The private tried to rise and couldn't. Conner hauled him up and helped him limp back toward the foxholes. Men emerged, staring at the shallow ditch, the churned ground, the wrecked machines. The terrain looked less like a field and more like a broken moonscape. Craters piled into craters, torn equipment, scattered metal, and too many bodies. At the line, the battalion commander met him. He looked out over the devastation, looked back at Conner, and didn't bother with a speech. Just a hard nod. Medics carried the private away. He would live. The wound was ugly but clean, no bone shattered. and he'd return weeks later. Back at the command post, Conner's shoulder was still numb. A medic finally found the culprit, a small fragment lodged just beneath the skin. It was removed and bandaged. Someone muttered that he was lucky. Then the intelligence section went forward to count and record what the guns had done. Bodies, abandoned equipment, notes for the after-action report. Confirmed numbers were grim, and estimates were worse. The enemy had carried many casualties back with them, but the loss was undeniable. What mattered most to the men in those foxholes was simpler. Once Conner began directing the artillery from that exposed ditch, American casualties essentially stopped, and the battalion held. Days later, a senior general, Lieutenant General Alexander Patch, commanding 7th Army, came to the unit to present Conner the Distinguished Service Cross. The citation spoke plainly. He'd run wire under fire, directed artillery from an exposed position for hours, and called rounds onto his own location when the enemy closed to within yards. The battalion commander had pushed for the Medal of Honor, but war paperwork moved slowly, and Conner's time in combat had already stretched beyond what the Army wanted to risk. After months on the line and 7 wounds, he was rotated home. He left France in March, crossed the Atlantic, and by the time the war in Europe ended, he was already back in Kentucky, trying to fold himself into a life that didn't involve artillery corrections and freezing ditches. His hometown threw a celebration. Another famous war hero, Alvin York, spoke at the event. Conner stood there, small and quiet, while people read off citations that sounded like they belonged to someone else. That day, he met Pauline Wells. She'd heard the stories, heard the list of medals, and couldn't reconcile any of it with the calm farmer in front of her. Conner didn't perform the war for anyone. When people asked questions, he brushed them away, saying those memories were left overseas and he wasn't bringing them home. He married Pauline that summer. They worked land the old way, mules, horses, tobacco, and corn, on a farm without electricity or running water. Later, when a reservoir project forced them to move, they started again on new ground. Conner became a respected local leader in the farming community, advising others on crops and conservation and dealing with government forms. He spent time helping other veterans file claims and navigate the system. But he didn't talk about what happened near Houssen. The medals stayed hidden, packed into a plain box, tucked away in a duffel bag in a closet. Pauline knew where they were. She'd seen them. She almost never saw them again. Decades passed. In the mid-1990s, a letter arrived from a veteran named Richard Chilton, researching the death of an uncle who'd served alongside Conner. Conner invited him in. In the living room, elderly and ill, Conner talked about the old days, about the lost soldier. And as he spoke, he broke down. Half a century didn't dull the edge of it. Pauline suggested Chilton look through Conner's records. She brought out the duffel bag. Chilton opened the box, saw the medals, read the citations, and froze. Then he said what Pauline had never stopped thinking. This should have been a Medal of Honor case. Chilton began gathering statements and pushing paperwork. The system rejected it, then rejected it again. Conner died before anything changed. Pauline refused to let the story die with him. She kept searching for witnesses. She found men who had been in the foxholes, who had watched that lone lieutenant ahead of the line for hours, who had seen artillery land impossibly close and still keep coming because he kept calling it. She resubmitted. Years passed with no movement. Historians and lawmakers added their voices. Retired generals endorsed the upgrade. Still nothing. Eventually, Pauline took the fight into federal court. The case wound through appeals and mediation. At one point, even the government side cracked, because the story wasn't abstract anymore. People realized how many lives might have hinged on that ditch. The Army Board finally recommended the upgrade. Congress acted to remove the time barrier. The White House announced the decision in 2018, and that summer, in the East Room, the Medal of Honor was presented to Pauline, now an old woman, on behalf of the husband who'd never asked for it, never displayed it, and never spoke of it as if it were his to claim. The citation was read aloud. The run under fire with wire and handset, the hours exposed ahead of the line, the decision to call rounds onto himself, the enemy attack broken, the battalion saved. Pauline held the medal and carried the weight of the decades it took to reach her hands. And that's the part people miss when they only hear the headline. Sometimes the act happens in 3 brutal hours, but the remembering takes half a lifetime. If you want more stories like this, stories pulled from old reports and living room boxes, help this one travel. Leave a like so the algorithm doesn't bury it. Subscribe if you want a steady stream of forgotten heroism brought back into the light. And drop a comment. Where are you watching from? And did someone in your family serve? Because the fastest way for names like Garlin Conner to disappear is silence. And the simplest way to keep them alive is to say out loud that you were here to hear it.